Hello, this is Dr. Flight, and thank you for joining us on this video lecture today on nonprofit organizations. This specific topic or video will talk a little bit about the evolution of nonprofit organizations, also the spread and growth of nonprofit organizations in international markets, and then also talk a little bit about how nonprofit organizations emerge as a result of failed or inefficient government support and or failed and inefficient market support in order to solve the society's some of society's basic needs. So in the absence, in other words, of the government support or market support, nonprofits fill a void a lot of times to help provide basic needs for people. So that's the general idea of this video. Again, thank you for spending some time and watching and learning about nonprofit organizations. Okay, so we're going to begin by spending a little bit of time talking about how nonprofit organizations have evolved over time and the role that they've played in the broader context of society. So when we first track the idea of a nonprofit or a collective service type of an organization, the first notion or context that you would think of this as being in is something called the Voluntary Civics period. And when we think about voluntary civics, what we're thinking about is a communal environment where a group of people get together to solve a local need that they all share. And ideally, this need is something that not any single individual could solve on their own, but together they come together to better the community as a whole. So you could think about maybe a long time ago where the community would get together and they would build a building, and then that building would serve as a meeting house for the village. And they would have meetings there, they would have gatherings there, it would be a space that the whole community could share, but also no single individual would, kind of be responsible for it, but it would be something that the entire group would have. The next phase or the next kind of development happened as some of the people in the community would clearly become better off financially, in a capitalist kind of environment. So this was noted in the U.S. during the rapid growth of the Industrial Revolution, where you'd have a lot of individuals who were relatively new to wealth, and they were willing to give a lot of that wealth away for the greater good of the community and the larger society as a whole. So philanthropic patronage is the name of this category. And you've got people like Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller, Milton Hershey, William Randolph Hearst, and so on. So this notion is this generosity of the wealthy. But in particular, you'll note that a lot of these individuals are all new, like new money. It's not passed down money. It's new money that was created as a result of capitalistic growth. The third category is the rights and entitlement category, where there's this sense of community that people have certain inalienable or certain rights that in a advanced society they should be provided for. So think of this as people are owed a certain, level of something. In the United States, we feel like everybody should have access to education, for instance. That's not the case everywhere, and that hasn't always been the case, but as a culture, we feel like it's important that everybody, growing up has a right to a certain level and degree and access to an educational, background. So we've built that into our culture and what we think we owe. So, and largely this is a government intervention type of a a sense. The fourth category is something called competitive market, where we have a reliance on the community, on philanthropy, and also the government, but we can't be assured. But these things all together cannot necessarily assure, or they don't guarantee um, that that they will continue to provide all the benefits and the needs of the community, and that at some degree, at some level, the public has to provide for itself. It has to fend for itself. It has to grow itself. So, in this sense, we might say, well, we have a need for cleaner fuels to be able to operate our cars. But the government won't necessarily step in, and maybe philanthropists might not, but there may be varying solutions, like electric cars or hydrogen cars or something like that. So we allow competitive pressures to come in and solve the problem that exists. Okay, so again, four different types of ideas that generate this idea of service. And actually, even if we think about today, this philanthropic patronage is really alive and well. Again, think about new money and think about philanthropy as it emerges or is emerging today with the likes of the William and Melinda Gates Foundation and Buffett and Soros and Zuckerberg and so on. There are lots of folks today who are willing to give, and their legacy, quite frankly, will be felt for the next couple hundred years in terms of what they're able to do. So all four of these types of service, communal service, actually exist today, and we can see examples of that as well. All right, so nonprofit then, the idea then of having an organization function in one of these four roles is a fairly new thing. And one of the motivations of having an organization operate in a service environment is that it can be done in a more efficient way. So one of the challenges, though, is that in our era today, there's a lot of competition among not-for-profits, and as a community of givers, we're very concerned about how well our money is being used when we donate it to a nonprofit. So improved management skills are ever more needed in the nonprofit sector. And when we think about managing an organization, what it typically comes down to is how resources are being used, and if resources are being used efficiently. Okay, so that is a big push that we have. In fact, many non-for-profits now are scored in terms of how efficiently they use money. So administrative overhead, for instance, is something that is looked at as money not going to the need and money going to the organization instead. More transparency. That's important as well. We also know that small nonprofits, and even large nonprofits for that matter, they mimic or they look very much like a for-profit organization in terms of how it's run. So nonprofits, in terms of the management style of them, are very, very similar to for-profits, and so many of the management principles that are used in business can also apply in the nonprofit setting. So moving forward then, thinking of nonprofits today, again, we've looked at kind of the four different evolutionary types of need and how needs are met within the society. We know that managerial skills are needed. We also know, though, that nonprofits today have a very big and large footprint internationally, which we'll talk about in a second, but they also take up a lot of space within our economic community domestically as well. So there are over 1.5 million nonprofits, and over 28% of U.S. citizens volunteer to some degree at a nonprofit organization. So they represent a very large component of our economic system even today. And like I said, there's a very strong international component to nonprofits, in the sense that nonprofits very often cross borders, so they're serving needs that are similar to multiple different destinations, and that's been a strong growth feature, in fact, for nonprofits moving forward. In fact, when you think about where nonprofits grow and how they grow internationally, there's six elements here to think about as components to growth on an international scale. One component or proponent that's generating international growth is the advancement of technology and literacy. In particular across the international landscape. As technology becomes diffused around the world and in impoverished countries, those cultures can advance faster with greater and more rapid technological change. It also happens as well when literacy rates improve. Another element here in terms of pushing growth internationally is this idea that a lot of the world problems that exist that we think of are very old problems. So people getting sick from basic diseases, some diseases that have cures, but the people simply don't have access to vaccinations, or lifestyle practices that prevent disease, or malnourishment in lifestyle, eating good foods, boiling water, access to clean water. These are all very old world problems. And one of the things that generates growth in nonprofits is when technology comes along that replaces solutions that we have, so we get better solutions to old world problems. Number three, so the third driver here of pushing nonprofits internationally, greater relationship building and partnership building between private and public organizations, for sure. So better strategic partnering resources help nonprofits grow, especially in the international community as well. So what's driving international growth in nonprofits? Technology advances and growth in literacy, dissatisfaction with current solutions to old problems, so and with the advent of new technology, greater strategic partnerships. So those are three things that are growing international nonprofit growth. Three more elements here include development of social capital. So, as countries and as cultures that are needing more nonprofit, emphasis, I guess, as they develop skills and workforce features, then this is what we think of as social capital. And as social capital grows through education and things like that, then the culture advances. So as the culture advances, then more and more emphasis can be placed economically in that environment, and so that's actually a good thing that we want to be able to capture. The fifth and the sixth elements here, so in terms of driving international growth, converting demand to supply, this is actually a really big one. The idea here is once you solve a need, then sometimes what happens is you either create more need or you create another paradigm, basically. So think about this. As we're developing social capital, as a culture, say, is becoming literate, then all of a sudden that literate culture needs different emphasis on like work and jobs. And so now all of a sudden we have a workforce that's literate. And so that workforce now creates a supply of labor in this case. So a new problem, which is good, a new situation or paradigm evolves from that solved problem. And again, that's, if we want to look for more trading partners, we need to find, environments where the workforce is strong. If the workforce is strong, it is probably because it's educated. So one solution leads to other possibilities for growth and such. And then finally, increased stakeholders, external stakeholders, and so forth. So being able to bring partners to solve a problem brings external stakeholders who then have a reason to reinvest in the culture. So if we are able to, for instance, an international nonprofit is able to say come in and vaccinate a region. Now all of a sudden there's investment dollars that want to come in because that region is stabilized. If that region is stabilized, then it means there's going to be less armed conflict. There's going to be fewer needs for medical assistance and so on and so forth. So external stakeholders start to invest in the process, and again, growth and technology sort of grow from there. Okay, so without question, the bigger picture here to remember is that nonprofit organizations represent a large portion of the economy, and a lot of the growth in nonprofits has happened in an international environment. Yeah. So from a broader perspective then, and thinking about again what can generate nonprofit organizational growth within a region or a country or an area, typically what happens is a nonprofit will emerge when a service is needed that is not being provided by the government or not being provided by the market. And when I say market, I mean businesses and business organizations that would be there to serve the marketplace. So when the market fails to provide a service that's needed, or the government fails to provide a service that's needed, then nonprofits emerge. That's kind of what we look for. Now, occasionally, of course, nonprofits work with companies and with businesses. They partner with them. Also, a lot of times nonprofits work with governments, but they work with those two institutions when the institutions fail to provide the basic needs that are being served by the nonprofit to begin with. Now, elements that can influence this model would be, one, if the population is extremely diverse. This happens where if there's a lot of different cultures all melding together, the different cultures tend not to serve the same purpose with each other. So you have one culture looking to serve themselves, another culture, again, pushing back on that and trying to serve themselves. And so when you have a lot of fracturing of the community, then it's hard for the government to play a strong role in solving problems. So this may be where nonprofits emerge. When the government is extremely large and in size, and another influence here is when people are taxed so much that they don't feel like giving or donating to nonprofits would be beneficial. So the underlying idea here is when a government taxes a lot, people don't feel like they feel like the government then should be obligated to provide all the needs of the community as opposed to having nonprofits step in. So that's actually one of the reasons in the United States, if you think about the protection that nonprofits have for our tax code and the laws that protect nonprofits, part of that protection actually creates an environment where people are more willing to give to the nonprofits because they're receiving tax benefits and they're receiving benefits from the government. So it's kind of a blend of where the government relies on nonprofits, but at the same time they support the nonprofits by giving them tax breaks and other incentives. Okay, so the third element here that really heavily influences the model that I'm describing between government and market failure happens when the degree of public support and donations for services becomes weak in some capacity. So again, there are situations where the general public doesn't feel like they should support a nonprofit because either there's some government intervention or some other influence taking. So now we're going to look at, again, another model where we think about government regimes and their role in promoting or disavowing a nonprofit, and that kind of the relationship between the rise of nonprofits in the absence of government and vice versa. And the different categories. So the statist regime of government then is one where the government supports the elite, the well-to-do and the rich, and as a result, they don't really provide for the needs of nonprofits, but also at the same time, the rich don't either. So the result is then a very little amount spent on social welfare because the elite are control power and they control the government, and very few nonprofits and social net type environments because nobody really, the people who have money aren't willing to spend it on those types of things. A liberal regime is one that is again generally hostile, or one where the government is not sought for the solutions of society is essentially what it is. However, they do recognize in a liberal regime, in this context, in this model, they do recognize, though, the need for nonprofits. So the relative importance of nonprofits is strong because they would rather not have the government taking a strong proactive role. The social democrat regime is one that supports a strong government, a lot of social programs, but does not necessarily lean on nonprofits to provide any social net or social need, that rather the government should provide for this. So a lot of European countries follow this type of a philosophy more so, probably. In the United States, we're kind of a blend between a social democrat type of an environment, probably in a liberal environment. The last group is called the corporatist, and this is one where there's a strong government oversight involved, and that oversight is actually happens in conjunction with nonprofits. So you might see much more collaboration between the government and the nonprofits working together to provide services. So this is actually, again, it's not uncommon to see a relationship where the government has the infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily have the resources to reach individual people, so they lean on nonprofits. They'll actually pay nonprofits to perform social duties. So it's almost like the government may outsource the kind of the social net issues, so social kind of welfare issues to nonprofits, and so they'll actually support nonprofits financially and in ways like that. Okay, so this video has actually covered quite a bit of ground in terms of what we're talking about in nonprofits. We began by thinking about the evolution or the four different components or types of nonprofit emergence, from the voluntary civics idea to philanthropic patronage, which you still see a lot today, the rights and entitlement mentality, and then the competitive environment, organization as well. Spent a good amount of time thinking about international growth and what helps drive international growth, from technology to increased resources and things like that. Also, and very importantly, the driver of nonprofits, not only internationally but locally, but the driver of nonprofits includes this notion that that governments sometimes fail to provide services, and sometimes the market, the for-profit market, fails to provide services. And when there's that void, when there's that gap, then nonprofits flourish and emerge. And that finally wrapped up this conversation with different types of government regimes, again, that kind of illustrate the relationship between needing to fill gaps by nonprofits and the role that governments play in providing for social needs. So this theory is actually really important, and this model, knowing the statist, liberal, social democrat, and corporatist regime ideas, is actually fundamental in understanding why and how nonprofits exist. Okay, so this lecture, or this video, then kind of covers a lot of ground in that respect, and talks a lot about kind of why we need nonprofits and why they emerge and what happens kind of theoretically to create them. Okay, so thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to touch base with me. And again, I hope you enjoyed this discussion on nonprofit organizations.